think about it, how one person, their ideas, can just completely reshape the world.
Incredible, isn't it?
And the 20th century, I mean, with all its massive changes, its conflicts, it really has the undeniable stamp of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, the driving force behind the Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
So today, we're really diving deep into his life.
Yeah, and our exploration today, it's based on a really thorough overview of Lenin's life and his activities.
Mhm.
We're basically tracing his path from, well, a fairly comfortable start
Right.
through his increasing radicalization all the way to leading the Bolshevik Revolution and, setting up this entirely new kind of state.
We'll definitely be hitting those major turning points, the key events.
Exactly, giving you a solid picture.
Our goal here, our mission with this deep dive, is to get beyond just the basic facts. We want to pull out the really crucial insights, maybe some surprising bits too, about Lenin's story, his core beliefs, and, well, the massive impact he had.
Think of it as a guided tour.
Exactly. A shortcut to understanding this really pivotal figure without getting bogged down in every single detail. Okay, let's start right at the beginning.
All right. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, born in Simbirsk, that was back in 1870. And what's fascinating right away is his family background. It's incredibly diverse.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking Russian, German, Swedish, Jewish, and possibly even some Kalmyk ancestry in there.
Wow.
And his father's story is pretty striking, too. He actually rose up from being born a serf to become a respected educator in the middle class and was eventually even granted nobility.
That's quite a climb. And his mother, Maria, she also came from an educated background, right? German, Swedish Lutheran, and Russian Jewish Christian roots.
That's right. And an interesting historical footnote, our sources suggest Lenin himself probably didn't even know about his mother's Jewish heritage. That discovery came much later.
Huh. That adds another layer, doesn't it?
It certainly does. So he was the third of 8 kids, known as Volodya, growing up. Sadly, 2 of his siblings died young.
And his parents' views, initially they were pretty mainstream for the time.
Yeah. Initially, they supported the monarchy, leaned sort of liberal conservative. But Volodya, even young, he showed this sharp mind, very close to his sister Olga, apparently quite competitive, too.
But academically strong.
Oh, yes, excelled at the Simbirsk Classical Gymnasium. And he wasn't just bookish, enjoyed sports, chess, too.
Okay, so a bright kid, relatively normal upbringing. But then things take a sharp turn. 2 big events.
Exactly. First, his father dies in 1886, and then, maybe even more impactful, his older brother, Alexander, gets involved in revolutionary activity.
The plot to assassinate the Tsar.
Precisely. Alexander was radicalized and ultimately executed for his role in that plot against Tsar Alexander III.
And that just completely shifted Lenin's world.
It seems to be the absolute crucial turning point. His brother's execution appears to have fundamentally changed his belief. It led him to ditch his religious faith entirely and just dive headfirst into revolutionary politics.
You can really see the seeds of the Lenin we know being sown right there.
No doubt. And shortly after, he did enroll at Kazan Imperial University, but that didn't last long.
Expelled.
Yep. For joining student protests against government crackdowns on student groups. But getting kicked out didn't exactly stop his learning, did it? If anything, it seemed to fuel it.
Right. He just dove into reading on his own.
Absolutely. Intense self-study. And one book that really hit home was Nikolai Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done.
Ah, key title.
And then, through a guy named Nikolai Fedosiev, he really encounters Marxism properly. Reads Karl Marx's Das Kapital.
And that was it.
That seemed to ignite everything. He became incredibly passionate about Marxist ideas, class struggle, the idea that capitalism would inevitably lead to socialism and then communism.
I can only imagine how his family felt about this sudden radical turn.
Well, yeah, they were pretty concerned, understandably. His mother even bought some land, hoping he'd, settle down and take up farming.
A bit of a long shot, sounds like.
It definitely didn't stick. His mind was clearly elsewhere.
So after that attempt at rural redirection failed,
the family moved to Samara in 1889. And there, Lenin gets involved in a socialist discussion group led by Alexei Sklyrenko. This was a really formative time.
solidifying his beliefs.
Totally. He even translated the Communist Manifesto into Russian. And crucially, he started aligning himself with Georgy Plekhanov's view.
Plekhanov argued Russia was already heading towards capitalism.
Yes, and that the industrial working class, the proletariat, would be the main force driving a socialist revolution.
Which clashed directly with the Narodniks.
Right. The Narodniks, the agrarian socialists, they thought Russia could kind of skip capitalism and build socialism based on the existing peasant communes.
Lenin wasn't buying that.
fundamentally disagreed on the peasant's role. But it's interesting, though, he was still influenced by some Narodnik figures, like Pyotr Tkachev and Sergei Nechayev. Their ideas about revolutionary organization maybe stuck with him.
Okay, so he's deep into theory. How does he get back into formal education? The law degree.
Well, here's a twist. His mother stepped in again. She used her connections to get him permission to sit the law exams externally at St. Petersburg University in 1890.
And he passed?
Passed with honors, actually. A big achievement, though sadly it happened around the same time his sister Olga died from typhoid fever.
So he gets the law degree, but a conventional legal career wasn't really on the cards, was it?
Not really. He did some legal work back in Samara, but his focus remained on radical politics, discussing Marx with Sklyarenko's group, trying to figure out how Marxist theory applied specifically to Russia.
Trying to ground the theory in Russian reality.
Exactly. Inspired by Plekhanov, he spent a lot of time gathering Russian economic data. He was looking for hard evidence, empirical proof to back up the Marxist stages of development and refute those Narodnik ideas.
Did he publish anything then?
He tried. Wrote an article on the peasant economy, but it got rejected. Still, this whole period in Samara, it really laid the groundwork for everything that came next.
Okay, so he's fully committed to Marxism. What's the next step on this revolutionary path?
The next really big move is heading to St. Petersburg in late 1893. He did work as a lawyer there for a bit.
But that wasn't the main event.
Not at all. His real focus was becoming a key player among the Marxist Social Democrats. This group was modeled on the German Social Democratic Party, a big influence.
And he was actively organizing?
Very actively, encouraging revolutionary cells in Russia's industrial areas. By late 94, he's leading a Marxist workers' circle, always having to be careful about police spies.
And this is when Nadezhda Krupskaya enters the picture, a really significant figure in his life.
Absolutely. Nadia. She was a Marxist schoolteacher, and they connected instantly over their shared political and intellectual passions. It became a lifelong partnership.
Did he publish anything significant around this time?
Yes, he wrote What the Friends of the People Are and How They Fight the Social Democrats. It was a direct attack on the Narodniks, drawing heavily on his Samara experiences. It had to be circulated illegally, of course, in limited numbers.
And then he decides to connect with the established Marxists abroad.
Right. To link up the burgeoning Russian movement with the older generation Marxist emigres living in Switzerland, Lenin travels to Western Europe.
This trip seems pretty crucial for him.
Hugely important. He meets Plekhanov and Pavel Axelrod, the big names from the Emancipation of Labor group. He goes to Paris, studies the history of the 1871 Paris Commune. He saw that as a vital kind of blueprint for a future workers' state.
And met Marx's son-in-law.
Yes, Paul Lafargue. His mother helped fund the trip, actually. He also spent time in Switzerland, supposedly for health reasons, before heading to Berlin. Spent 6 weeks there studying, met the prominent German Marxist Wilhelm Liebknecht.
Soaking it all in. But on his return to Russia, he didn't exactly lie low, did he?
Not Lenin's style. He immediately started distributing the illegal political literature he'd picked up abroad among worker groups.
Which inevitably attracted attention.
With time. This led directly to his arrest in St. Petersburg in 1895. He and about 39 other activists were picked up while finalizing a publication for Рабочее дело, the workers' cause. The charge was sedition.
So prison. But even locked up, his mind kept working.
Oh, absolutely. He refused a lawyer, denied all the charges, but while in prison for a year awaiting trial, he wrote one of his major early works, The Development of Capitalism in Russia.
What was the core argument there?
He argued that industrial capitalism was rapidly taking hold in Russia, drawing peasants into the cities and creating this massive proletariat. And drawing on Marx, he theorized that this working class would inevitably develop class consciousness, overthrow the czar, establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, and ultimately build socialism.
Laying out the theoretical path forward.
Exactly. It was foundational for his revolutionary strategy.
And the sentence for sedition.
3 years exile. Eastern Siberia. Starting February 1897. A pretty hard sentence. It was exile, yeah, but interestingly, without a formal trial. He got a few days in St. Petersburg first to sort things out, meet the Social Democrats one last time. They'd just renamed themselves the League of Struggle for the Emancipation of the Working Class.
And his family went with him.
His mother and sisters traveled with him on that long journey to Siberia. But because he was seen as, well, a relatively minor threat at that point, the exile wasn't super strict. He lived in a peasant house in Shushenskoye under police watch, yes, but...
Not exactly locked down.
Not really. He could still communicate with other revolutionaries. People even visited him. It wasn't total isolation.
And Nadia Krupskaya joined him there eventually.
Yes, Nadia herself was arrested later for organizing a protest and exiled. She was initially supposed to go to Ufa, but she petitioned to be sent to Shushenskoye instead, claiming she and Lenin were engaged.
And they got married in exile.
They did, in July 1898. They lived there with Nadia's mother, actually. The couple spent a lot of time translating socialist texts from English into Russian.
So intellectual work continued even in Siberia.
Definitely. Lenin was also closely following the debates happening within German Marxism. He became aware of Edward Bernstein and the revisionists.
Who were arguing for a peaceful parliamentary path to socialism.
Right. Lenin wasn't having any of it. He doubled down on the need for violent revolution, blasting the revisionists in a pamphlet called A Protest by Russian Social Democrats.
And finished his big book.
Yes, in 1899, he completed and got The Development of Capitalism in Russia, published under the pseudonym Vladimir Lenin. It was his biggest work yet, tearing into the agrarian socialists and laying out the Marxist case for Russia's development. Didn't get universal praise, though, faced quite a bit of criticism.
Okay, so Siberia's done, exile ends. What's the next chapter?
After Siberia, he moves briefly to Pskov in early 1900. His main focus now, raising money for a new Marxist newspaper.
Iskra, the spark.
That's the one. It was intended to be the main propaganda tool for the newly formed Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, the RSDLP. By July 1900, he's left Russia again, heading for Western Europe, met up with Russian Marxists in Switzerland, went to a conference.
And they decide to base the paper where?
Munich. That became Lenin's new base from September 1900.
And Iskra became incredibly important, didn't it? More than just a paper.
Oh, massively important. It had contributions from all the major Russian Marxists. It was smuggled into Russia, and you could argue became the most influential underground publication there for decades.
The real organizing force.
Absolutely. It was key for uniting scattered Marxist groups and getting their ideas out. And it's during this Iskra period, December 1901, that he adopts the pseudonym Lenin, possibly inspired by the Lena River in Siberia, though the exact origin isn't certain. He often used N. Lenin.
And under this name, he publishes another hugely influential work.
Yes, in 1902, What is to be Done? This pamphlet is where he really lays out his argument for a vanguard party.
The idea of a core group of professional revolutionaries needed to lead the working class.
Exactly. A dedicated, disciplined party to guide the proletariat, rather than just relying on spontaneous uprising. This was a major development in his thinking. A bit of a departure from some earlier Marxist ideas.
And Nadia was right there with him through all this.
Right by his side. She joined him in Munich, became his personal secretary, handling a mountain of organizational work. They both wrote constantly for Iskra. Lenin drafted the official RSDLP program, hammering away at dissenters and critics, especially the Socialist Revolutionary Party, the SRs.
The Narodnik-inspired group.
Right. And interestingly, while still fiercely Marxist, Lenin starts incorporating some Narodnik ideas about the revolutionary potential of the Russian peasantry around this time. This led to another pamphlet in 1903, To the Rural Poor.
They had to move from Munich, though.
Yeah, to dodge the Bavarian police, who were cracking down. They moved the whole Iskra operation to London in April 1902. That's where Lenin struck up a friendship with a young Russian-Ukrainian Marxist named Leon Trotsky.
Ah, another key figure emerges.
But then Lenin got sick, couldn't really lead the editorial team for a while, so they moved the headquarters again, this time to Geneva, without him initially.
Then comes the Second Congress of the RSDLP in London, 1903. This is the big split, right? Bolsheviks and Mensheviks.
This is it. A really pivotal and ultimately very messy moment. The Congress saw this major ideological clash between Lenin's camp and supporters of Yuliy Martov.
What was the core issue?
It boiled down to party membership. Martov wanted a looser definition you could be a member even if you weren't super active in a party organization. Lenin, though, he insisted on a much tighter centralized party. Only active revolutionaries under strict party discipline should be members.
And Lenin's side won a key vote.
On that specific vote, yes, his faction got a temporary majority. So they became known as the Bolsheviks majority in Russian. Martov's side, finding themselves in the minority on that vote, became the Mensheviks minority.
But those labels, majority and minority, they kind of stuck. Even though the numbers shifted later, they came to represent deeper divisions.
Exactly. It became symbolic. Bolsheviks generally stood for that centralized vanguard party leading the revolution from the top down. Mensheviks, also Marxists, tended to favor a more democratic, maybe slower approach building a broader base, waiting for more capitalist development first.
And the fighting continued after the Congress.
Fiercely. Accusations flew back and forth. Bolsheviks called Mensheviks opportunists. Mensheviks called Lenin a dictator. Lenin got so frustrated he actually quit the Iskra editorial board. Then, in May 1904, he published One Step Forward, Two Steps Back, basically attacking the Menshevik position.
All this infighting must have been exhausting.
It took a real toll on Lenin's health. He ended up taking a recuperative walking holiday in Switzerland. But by spring 1905, the Bolsheviks had managed to gain dominance in the RSDLP Central Committee, and by December they launched their own separate newspaper, Vpered Forward.
And then 1905, the first Russian Revolution erupts, a real baptism of fire for these competing revolutionary ideas.
Absolutely. The Bloody Sunday Massacre in St. Petersburg in January 1905 just set the whole Russian Empire ablaze with unrest. Lenin saw it as proof of the Tsar's brutality and urged the Bolsheviks to jump right in, embrace violent uprising.
He even adopted some SR tactic.
He did. Talked about armed insurrection, mass terror, seizing land stuff that made the Mensheviks accuse him of abandoning orthodox Marxism. Lenin, in turn, wanted a complete split from the Mensheviks then and there.
But the Bolsheviks weren't all ready for that.
Most weren't. So they patched things up temporarily, enough to attend the third RSDLP Congress together in London in April 1905.
And during this revolutionary period, Lenin really clarifies his strategy in two tactics of social democracy and the democratic revolution, right?
Yes. Published August 1905. This is crucial. He argues the Russian liberal bourgeoisie, the middle class, they'll ultimately betray the revolution. They'll settle for a constitutional monarchy, side with the landowners against the workers and peasants.
So who should lead?
He proposed an alliance between the proletariat and the peasantry to overthrow the Tsar completely and set up what he called a revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry.
A specific formula.
And he was very clear about the need for force. He wrote, famously, "The uprising has begun. Blood is flowing freely. Civil war for freedom is blazing up." He believed the working class had to take the lead, not just play second fiddle to the bourgeoisie.
The Tsar did offer some concessions after 1905, the October Manifesto. Did that allow Lenin back into Russia?
Yes, the slightly more liberal atmosphere let him return to St. Petersburg. He joined the editorial team of Novaya Zin's New Life, a radical but legal newspaper funded by a wealthy sympathizer, Maria Andreeva.
And used it as a platform.
Absolutely. Pushing for broader party recruitment, urging more violent demonstrations, he saw both as essential to keep the pressure on.
But running a revolutionary party costs money. How did they fund things?
That became a major issue. Party dues and donations weren't cutting it. So Lenin and others endorsed expropriations.
Which basically means robberies.
Essentially, yes. Robbing government post offices, railway stations, banks. A group of Bolsheviks, led by Leonid Krasin, specialized in these. The most infamous was the Tiflis bank robbery in June 1907, organized by young Joseph Stalin.
Wow. That must have caused huge controversy, even among socialists.
Oh, definitely. It really deepened the rift within the RSDLP. The Mensheviks were horrified and strongly condemned Lenin's support for theft and violence at the 4th RSDLP Congress in Stockholm in April 1906.
Despite the controversy, Lenin kept pushing his faction's agenda.
He did. He helped set up the Bolshevik Center in Kukula, Finland. It had a bit more autonomy within the Russian Empire then, safer for political work. And by the 5th Congress in London, May 1907, the Bolsheviks actually had a majority within the overall party.
But the Tsarist government cracked down again.
Yeah. The Tsar dissolved the parliament, the Duma, and the Okhrana, the secret police, started rounding up revolutionaries again. Lenin had to flee. Back to Switzerland this time.
More exile.
And more problems. He tried to exchange the stolen money from the Tiflis robbery, which proved really difficult. It just brought more unwanted attention to their methods.
And during this next period of exile, cracks started appearing within the Bolshevik faction itself, particularly with Alexander Bogdanov.
Yes, that's right. Bogdanov and others decided to move the Bolshevik Center to Paris. Lenin didn't like the idea, but went along reluctantly in December 1908. He apparently hated Paris.
What was the disagreement with Bogdanov about? It seems quite philosophical.
It was deep. Bogdanov believed the Russian working class needed to develop its own socialist culture first, before it could really lead a revolution. He focused on cultural transformation. Lenin, though, prioritized building that vanguard party of intellectuals to lead the workers' politics first.
And they clashed on philosophy, too.
Big time. Bogdanov was influenced by thinkers like Ernst Mach, leaning towards relativism, the idea that reality is shaped by our perception. Lenin was a staunch materialist. Following Marx believed in an objective reality existing independently of us.
So fundamental differences about reality and how change happens.
Exactly. They even took a holiday together at Maxim Gorky's villa in Capri in 1908, but it didn't resolve the tension. Back in Paris, Lenin pushed for a formal split within the Bolsheviks, accusing Bogdanov of straying from Marxism.
He wrote a book about this.
Yes, he holed up in the British Museum in London in May 1908, researching and writing Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, which was a blistering attack on Bogdanov's ideas, calling them reactionary bourgeois distortions.
Lenin's approach seems pretty divisive, even among his own comrades.
It really was. His forceful, often uncompromising tactics alienated quite a few Bolsheviks, including guys who'd been close allies, like Rykov and Kamenev.
And the Tsarist secret police exploited these divisions.
The Okrata certainly did. They managed to plant an agent, Roman Malinowski, right near the top of the Bolsheviks. Malinowski pretended to be a huge Lenin supporter. Some Bolsheviks were suspicious, but it's unclear how much Lenin himself knew or suspected.
Even with all this internal drama, Lenin still engaged with the broader international socialist movement.
Oh, yes. In August 1910, he went to the 8th Congress of the Second International in Copenhagen as an RSDLP delegate. Afterwards, he vacationed with his mother in Stockholm. Then he moved to France with Nadia and his sister.
And met Inessa Armand there?
Yes, in Paris. She was a French Bolshevik feminist. Some biographers believe they had a very close personal relationship, an affair, between about 1910 and 1912.
What was happening with the party organizationally?
Well, in June 1911, the RSDLP Central Committee decided they needed to refocus efforts inside Russia. So they shut down the Bolshevik Center in Paris and their newspaper, Proletary. Lenin tried to reassert his dominance by organizing a conference in Prague in January 1912.
How did that go?
It was mostly Bolsheviks who attended, but even then, he faced criticism for being too factional. It didn't fully restore his authority across the whole socialist movement.
Just before World War I breaks out, he's based in Krakow.
Yes, in Krakow, which was then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He used the university library there for research, kept in touch with the RSDLP inside Russia. He was pushing the Bolshevik deputies in the Duma to break ranks, with the Mensheviks always pushing that distinct Bolshevik line.
And Stalin visited him there.
Stalin did, yes, in January 1913. Lenin apparently called him a splendid Georgian. They discussed the future of non-Russian nationalities within the empire.
Health issues were starting to crop up too.
Both Lenin's and Nadia's health wasn't great. They moved to a place called Biaji Dunajec, and then eventually to Bern in Switzerland so Nadia could have surgery for a thyroid condition.
And then, bang, August 1914, World War I erupts. How did Lenin, the anti-imperialist revolutionary, react?
He was actually in Galicia, part of Austria-Hungary, when the war started. As a Russian citizen in enemy territory, he was briefly arrested.
Really?
Yeah, until they figured out he was actually an opponent of the Tsar. He and Nadia managed to get back to neutral Bern and later moved to Zurich in early 1916.
And his reaction to the war itself, especially how other socialists responded.
He was absolutely furious, particularly outraged when the German Social Democratic Party, the biggest socialist party in Europe, voted to support Germany's war effort. He saw this as a complete betrayal of socialist principles, a violation of the Second International's resolutions against war.
This broke his faith in the Second International.
Completely shattered it. He felt it totally collapsed as a revolutionary force. He started attending anti-war socialist conferences, like Zimmerwald in 1915 and Kienthal in 1916.
And what was his position there? It was pretty radical, wasn't it?
Extremely radical. He called on socialists everywhere, not just to oppose the imperialist war, but to actively work to turn it into a civil war, the proletariat rising up against the bourgeoisie and aristocracy in each country. This was definitely a minority view, even among anti-war socialists.
Turning world war into class war, that's pure Lenin.
Absolutely. Yeah. And personally, this was a tough time, too. His mother died in July 1916, and he couldn't go to the funeral. It hit him hard, apparently led to a period of real pessimism. He started worrying he might die before the revolution actually happened.
But he kept writing, kept developing his theories.
Oh, yes. In 1917, he published Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Here he argued that imperialism wasn't just a policy choice, but an inevitable result of monopoly capitalism. Capitalists needing new markets, cheap labor, resources.
And this would lead to more war.
Exactly. He predicted constant wars between imperialist powers until the whole system was overthrown by a worldwide proletarian revolution, which would then lead to socialism.
He was also rethinking some core Marxist ideas around this
He
time.
was. He dove back into reading Hegel, Feuerbach, Aristotle, the philosophers who had influenced Marx himself. And this led to a subtle but important shift. He moved away from a very rigid view that policy could be scientifically predetermined toward a greater emphasis on practice, on experience. He came to believe that only trying things out in the real world could truly prove if a policy was correct. He still saw himself as an orthodox Marxist, but he was definitely adapting.
And crucially, he broke with the traditional Marxist stage theory.
Yes. The standard idea was that you needed a bourgeois democratic revolution first, led by the middle class, before you could have a socialist revolution led by the proletariat. Lenin started arguing that in Russia, the proletariat could actually leapfrog that stage and overthrow Tsarism directly, moving straight towards socialism, a major adaptation for Russia's specific situation.
Which brings us to 1917, an absolutely pivotal year. 2 revolutions. Let's start with the February Revolution and Lenin's return. That journey itself is legendary.
It really is. His trip from Zurich back to Petrograd, St. Petersburg had been renamed in April 1917, including that passage through Germany in the sealed train, is iconic.
And his arrival.
He arrives at Finland Station in Petrograd and immediately gives this fiery speech. Doesn't waste a second. Attacks the new provisional government. Calls for a Europe-wide proletarian revolution.
Which must have shocked even some Bolsheviks.
It did. Some had been more willing to cooperate initially, but Lenin arrived with his April Theses, this clear, radical program he'd worked out on the journey. He attended Bolshevik meetings, slammed anyone talking about reconciling with the Mensheviks.
What were the key points of the April Theses?
He publicly condemned the Mensheviks and the SRs, who actually had a majority in the Petrograd Soviet at that point, for supporting the provisional government. He accused them of betraying socialism by backing what he saw as just another imperialist government continuing the war.
His demands were radical.
Absolutely. Immediate peace with Germany and Austria-Hungary. All power transferred to the Soviets, the Workers' and Soldiers' Councils. Nationalization of industry and banks. Confiscation of large landed estates. All aimed at setting up a proletarian government and heading straight for socialism.
How did the Mensheviks react?
They thought he was crazy, basically. Argued Russia wasn't ready for socialism, accused him of trying to plunge the country into a destructive civil war prematurely.
But Lenin kept pushing his agenda.
Tirelessly. Over the next few months, he's constantly attending Bolshevik Central Committee meetings, writing articles for the party newspaper Pravda, speaking directly to workers, soldiers, sailors, peasants in Petrograd, trying to win them over.
Things didn't all go smoothly for the Bolsheviks immediately, though. The July days, that was a setback, wasn't it?
It was. Lenin sensed growing frustration among Bolshevik supporters, the war dragging on, the provisional government seeming ineffective. He considered organizing an armed demonstration in Petrograd, kind of test the waters.
But he wasn't there when it happened.
No, he was actually unwell and had gone to Finland to rest. While he was away, these armed demonstrations by Bolshevik supporters erupted the July days. They were big but disorganized, ultimately premature.
And Lenin rushed back.
Heard the news, rushed back to Petrograd, realized they didn't have enough support for a full takeover yet, so he urged restraint. But the provisional government used the opportunity
To crack down.
Exactly. Issued arrest warrants for Lenin and other leaders, raided their offices, launched this smear campaign calling Lenin a German spy, very damaging during wartime.
So Lenin had to go into hiding.
Yes, he hid briefly in Petrograd, then fearing arrest, he and Grigory Zinoviev disguised themselves and slipped out of the city to a place called Razliv.
And even in hiding, he's writing.
Of course. That's when he starts writing The State and Revolution, a really key theoretical work outlining his vision for a post-revolutionary society, how the state would eventually wither away under communism.
Still pushing for armed uprising.
Absolutely. Hammering the Central Committee, arguing they needed to seize power. But initially, they rejected the idea at a secret meeting, too risky, they thought. So Lenin slipped away again, this time deeper into Finland, reaching Helsinki in August.
While Lenin's in hiding, this major event happens, the Kornilov affair, and that actually helps the Bolsheviks.
Ironically, yes, massively helps them. In August 1917, General Kornilov, the army commander-in-chief, a conservative, sends troops towards Petrograd. Looked like a military coup attempt against the provisional government.
So the government panicked.
Prime Minister Kerensky panicked. He appealed to the Petrograd Soviet for help. And crucially, he authorized arming worker militias, the Red Guards, many of whom were Bolsheviks, to defend the city.
Did Kornilov make it?
Nope. The two just fizzled out. Railway workers loyal to the Soviets stopped the troop trains. Agitators convinced soldiers to desert. But the consequences were huge.
How so?
It made the Bolsheviks look like saviors of the revolution against a right-wing threat. The Mensheviks and SRs, tied to the weak provisional government in the unpopular war, looked increasingly discredited.
And the Bolsheviks capitalized on this.
Big time. Trotsky, who was incredibly charismatic, became a leading figure in the Petrograd Soviet. And by September, the Bolsheviks actually won majorities in both the Moscow and Petrograd Soviets. A huge shift in support.
Lenin sees this shift from Finland and decides now is the time.
Exactly. He starts bombarding the Central Committee with letters, now. We have to seize power now. The government is weak. He argues delaying will just let counter-revolutionaries regroup. He secretly returns to Petrograd.
For that crucial meeting.
The absolutely critical Central Committee meeting on October 10th, or 23rd by our calendar. He argues forcefully, passionately, for an immediate armed uprising. And this time, he wins the vote, 10-2.
But still opposition within the party.
Oh, yes. Zinoviev and Kamenev were famously against it, argued the workers wouldn't support it, that the European revolution Lenin counted on wasn't guaranteed. Very risky.
But Lenin's will carried the day.
It did. The party immediately started planning the takeover.
Yeah.
The final strategy session was held at the Smolny Institute on October 24th. That was the headquarters for the Military Revolutionary Committee, the MRC.
The armed militia loyal to the Bolsheviks.
Largely loyal, yes. Formed during the Kornilov mess, now effectively under Bolshevik control.
And the actual seizure of power, the October Revolution itself, it was surprisingly quick and relatively bloodless, at least in Petrograd.
Remarkably so. Testament to their planning. In late October, early November for us, the MRC ordered the takeover of key points in Petrograd railway stations, bridges, post offices, telegraphs, power stations. Very little resistance.
And the Winter Palace?
They surrounded the Winter Palace where the provisional government ministers were holed up. The cruiser Aurora, controlled by Bolshevik sailors, fired a blank shot the signal. They stormed the palace, arrested the ministers.
Where was Lenin during all this?
Mostly behind the scenes during the actual fighting. But then he emerges, goes before the Petrograd Soviet, announces the provisional government is overthrown.
And forms a new government.
The Bolsheviks declare the formation of the Council of People's Commissars Sovnarkom. Lenin initially refused the chairmanship, suggested Trotsky, but the party insisted, so he accepted.
Then they make it official.
Lenin and the Bolsheviks go to the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviets, October 26-27th, announce the new Soviet government, issue the famous decrees on peace and land.
How did the other socialists react?
The Mensheviks and right-wing SRs were furious, denounced it as an illegal coup, warned it would lead straight to civil war.
But Lenin and the Bolsheviks felt unstoppable.
They were emboldened, yeah. Still very optimistic about that wave of proletarian revolutions sweeping across Europe any day now.
So the Bolsheviks are in power. Lenin now faces this monumental task, actually organizing and holding on to power in this massive, chaotic country.
Yeah.
What were the first steps?
Well, one immediate issue was the Constituent Assembly election, already scheduled for November 1917 by the previous government. Lenin was skeptical, worried it could undermine the Soviets' power.
But they let the election happen.
They did. But the results weren't great for the Bolsheviks. They got less than a quarter of the vote. The Socialist Revolutionaries, the SRs, won a clear majority.
How did Lenin react to that?
Dismissed it. Argued the results didn't reflect the people's real will. Voters weren't up to speed on Bolshevik policies yet. The candidate lists were old. Basically, he wasn't going to let an election stop him.
So when the assembly met...
It met in Petrograd in January 1918. The Sovnarkom immediately denounced it as counter-revolutionary, trying to steal power from the Soviets. The SRs and Mensheviks denied this, of course.
What happened next?
The Bolsheviks proposed a resolution saying the assembly had to recognize the Soviet government's authority. When the assembly refused, bang, the Sovnarkom declared it counter-revolutionary and sent in the Red Guards to shut it down. Forcibly dissolved after just one day.
Wow. A pretty clear statement about who was really in charge.
Absolutely. Showed Lenin's total commitment to Bolshevik control, even over democratic processes.
Was there any attempt at coalition government, bringing other socialists in?
Lenin consistently rejected that idea, even when some Bolsheviks suggested it. He saw the Mensheviks and SRs as fundamentally opposed to his vision. There was a very brief alliance with the left SRs, though.
The more radical faction.
Right. 5 left SRs joined the Sovnarkom in December 1917, mainly to make the government look a bit broader. But it didn't last. They walked out in March 1918 in protest over the peace treaty with Germany.
And the Bolsheviks changed their name around then.
Yes, at the Seventh Party Congress, March 1918, they officially became the Russian Communist Party. Lenin pushed for the change, wanted to clearly separate themselves from moderate socialists internationally, and signal their ultimate goal, communism.
So you have this formal government structure, Sovnarkom, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets. But where did the real power lie?
That's the crucial point. Theoretically, power was with the Soviets, represented by the Sovnarkom executive and the VTSICOM legislature, elected by the Congress. But in reality, power increasingly centered in the Communist Party itself.
Decisions made in the party, then rubber-stamped by the state.
Pretty much. By 1918, the Sovnarkom was acting very independently. The Congress and VTSI became marginalized. The local Soviets, initially meant to be organs of direct democracy, lost any real independent clout.
And other parties were pushed out.
Systematically. Throughout 1918-1919, Mensheviks and SRs were purged from the Soviets. It effectively became a one-party state.
And new party bodies were created to centralize control further.
Exactly. The Politburo to decide policy and the Orgburo to manage party organization. These became the real power centers. Decisions made there went to the Sovnarkom and the Council of Labor and Defense for implementation.
And Lenin was at the heart of all this.
Absolutely central. Chairman of Sovnarkom, key member of the Council of Labor Defense, the Central Committee, the Politburo. His close ally early on was Yakov Sverdlov, but he died tragically in the flu pandemic in March 1919, a big loss for Lenin.
Where was Lenin based physically?
Initially, in November 1917, he and Nadia moved into the Smolny Institute in Petrograd, the old girls' school that was Bolshevik HQ. But in March 1918, fearing the German advance, the government moved the capital to Moscow.
A temporary move.
Intended as temporary, but it stuck. Lenin, Trotsky, other leaders moved into the Kremlin. Lenin lived there with Nadia and his sister Maria in an apartment. Apparently, he never really liked Moscow, rarely left the city afterwards.
He survived assassination attempts, too.
Two serious ones. One in Petrograd in January 1918, his companion Fritz Platten shielded him. Then a more dangerous one in Moscow in August 1918, after he gave a speech.
Fanny Kaplan.
The SR.
Yes, she was arrested and executed for that second attempt. The news actually generated a wave of sympathy for Lenin, probably strengthened his position. He retreated to Gorky Leninsky, a nationalized estate outside Moscow, to recover in September 1918.
Alongside organizing the government, his administration pushed through massive reforms almost immediately. What were the big ones?
Right away, landmark decrees. First, the Decree on Land. Nationalized all private land aristocracy, church land, and said it should be redistributed to peasants by local committees.
Which was popular with peasants, but not exactly Lenin's ideal.
Right, it fit peasant demands, but Lenin himself preferred collectivization. Then, November 1917, the Decree on the Press allowed closing newspapers spreading counter-revolutionary ideas. Supposedly temporary, but a big step towards state control of information.
And rights for non-Russians.
Also, November 17, the Declaration of the Rights of the Peoples of Russia formally recognized the right to self-determination, even secession. Many nations took advantage. Finland, Lithuania declared independence in December. Others followed.
But the Bolsheviks hoped they'd rejoin eventually.
Yeah, they actively supported new communist parties in those states, hoping for a future socialist federation. Then, in July 1918, the Fifth All-Russian Congress of Soviets adopted a constitution, formally creating the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, RSFSR. Oh, and they switched to the Gregorian calendar, ditching the old Julian one.
Big economic changes, too, moving rapidly away from capitalism.
Huge changes. November 17, the Decree on Workers' Control theoretically gave workers oversight in factories via committees. Same month, nationalized all banks, confiscated private gold. Essential steps, they believed, for a socialist economy.
An essential body to manage the economy.
December 17, they set up the Supreme Soviet of the National Economy, the VSNKH. Had massive power to direct industry, agriculture, trade, everything. Factory committees got subordinated to trade unions, which were under the VSNKH. Central planning taking over.
Repudiating old debts, nationalizing trade.
Early 1918 canceled all foreign debts from the Tsarist era, caused a big international stir. April 18 nationalized foreign trade, creating a state monopoly. June 18 started nationalizing major industries, railways, engineering, textiles, mining. Took time to implement fully, but the direction was clear. Full nationalization, even smaller businesses, wasn't complete until late 1920.
One of the very first and most divisive decisions was getting Russia out of World War I, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Hugely controversial, right?
Incredibly controversial. It really shows Lenin's pragmatism, prioritizing the survival of the Bolshevik state above almost everything else. As soon as he took power, he was adamant. Russia had to get out of the war, make peace with Germany and Austria-Hungary.
Why the urgency?
He argued continuing the war would just fuel more unrest among the soldiers, destabilize the new government. Plus, he feared both the collapsing Russian army and the powerful German army posed threats to the revolution itself.
But not everyone in the party agreed.
Far from it. Big opposition, especially from Nikolai Bukharin and the so-called left communists. They saw making peace with imperialist Germany as a betrayal of socialist principles, of the international working class.
They wanted to keep fighting.
They advocated for a revolutionary defensive war, believed it would inspire German workers to rise up against their own government, spark that European revolution Lenin also hoped for, but through continued struggle.
But Lenin was convinced peace was the only way, even a harsh peace. This really shows his willingness to make tough, unpopular calls.
Absolutely. He proposed an immediate 3-month armistice in his Decree on Peace, November 1917. The Germans, busy on the Western Front and seeing a chance to secure the East, actually responded positively.
So negotiations started.
It started in Brest-Litovsk, German headquarters on the Eastern Front, in November. Trotsky and Adolf Joffe led the Russian delegation initially. An armistice was agreed until January.
But the German demands were tough.
Very tough. They wanted to keep huge territories that occupied Poland, Lithuania, Courland. The Russians argued this violated self-determination. Some Bolsheviks wanted a stall, still hoping for that European revolution to break out.
Then Trotsky came back with an ultimatum.
January 7th, 1918. Trotsky returns to Petrograd. The Central Powers basically said, accept our terms or the war restarts immediately. Trotsky, trying to buy time, maybe still hoping for revolution in the West, tried this famous tactic. Neither war nor peace. Refused to sign, then declared the war over anyway.
How did the Germans respond to that?
Predictably, on February 18th, they launched Operation Faustschlag, a massive, swift offensive. They advanced rapidly, took cities like Dvinsk in a day.
That forced Lenin's hand, showed the reality of German power.
It really did. This finally convinced enough doubters on the Bolshevik Central Committee that they had to accept the terms. Lenin had been arguing for acceptance all along. Now he had the votes.
And the Germans issued an even harsher ultimatum.
February 23rd. Accept even tougher terms. Recognize Poland, the Baltics, Ukraine as basically in Germany's sphere, or face a full-scale invasion aimed at Petrograd and Moscow. Faced with that, Lenin persuaded the Central Committee. They had to accept.
So the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed March 1918. What did Russia lose? It sounds devastating.
It was a massive blow. Russia lost about 26% of the former empire's population, 37% of its farmland, 28% of its industry, 26% of its railways, and 3/4 of its coal and iron reserves. Huge losses.
How was it received?
Fierce opposition across the board. Many Bolsheviks and the left SRs resigned from Sovnarkom in protest. Saw it as a total humiliation, a betrayal. The Sovnarkom then poured resources into trying to agitate German workers, printing anti-war leaflets.
Did that work?
Not really. The German government just expelled Russian diplomats. But in the end, Germany lost the war anyway. November 1918, the Kaiser abdicated. The new German government signed the armistice with the Allies. Brest-Litovsk became void.
So Russia got the territory back.
Not all of it immediately, but the immediate threat was gone, the treaty was dead.
The early Soviet years weren't just about treaties and government structure, they were also incredibly violent internally. Let's talk about the war against the kulaks, the Cheka, the Red Terror, a very dark period.
Extremely dark. It shows the lengths the Bolsheviks were willing to go to consolidate power and crush opposition. By early 1918, there were severe food shortages in the cities in Western Russia.
And Lenin blamed who?
The kulaks, the somewhat wealthier peasants who hired labor.
Yeah.
He accused them of hoarding grain for profit. In May 1918, he ordered armed detachments to forcibly requisition grain from them.
And set up committees to help.
June 1918, he established committees of the poor peasants. The idea was they'd help confiscate grain, kind of pitting poor peasants against richer ones. But the whole policy led to massive unrest, violence in the countryside, clashes, seizures of grain and livestock, often indiscriminate. Really escalated the risk of full-blown civil war.
There's that chilling telegram Lenin sent.
To Penza, August 1918, a prime example of his ruthlessness, his just cost. He explicitly ordered the public hanging of at least 100 kulaks, rich men, and bloodsuckers just to terrify the locals into submission during a peasant revolt.
And this brutality went hand in hand with the rise of the Cheka, the secret police, and the Red Terror.
Absolutely linked. Lenin consistently argued that terror and violence were necessary tools to destroy the old order and protect the revolution. He told the Soviet Executive Committee back in November 1917 that the state is always an instrument of coercion. Before, the rich used it against the people. Now the people would use it against the rich. He strongly opposed abolishing the death penalty.
So the Cheka was established to deal with threats.
Fearing counter-revolution and sabotage, Lenin set up the Cheka, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage, in December 1917. Put the utterly ruthless Felix Dzerzhinsky in charge.
And the Red Terror followed.
Officially declared in September 1918, right after that assassination attempt on Lenin. It was a systematic campaign of repression run by the Cheka.
Who were the targets?
While sometimes painted as wiping out the whole bourgeoisie, Lenin's main aim seemed to be targeting those actively fighting the Bolsheviks, trying to restore the old regime. So wealthy citizens, yes, but also former czarist officials, political opponents like Mensheviks and SRs, anyone deemed an enemy of the people.
And the Cheka had free reign?
Pretty much. They operated outside the normal legal system, could investigate, arrest, try, and execute people without public trials or judicial process. This led to mass arrests, mass executions all across Soviet Russia.
Do we know how many were killed?
The exact numbers are debated, but historians estimate tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, were killed during the Red Terror period.
Did Lenin publicly direct this?
He rarely talked about the Red Terror or the Cheka's specific actions in public. Preferred coded telegrams, secret letters. He wasn't pulling triggers himself, but his pronouncements, his policies absolutely created the climate for this violence, encouraged it even.
Were there any checks on the Cheka's power?
Some Bolsheviks got worried about the scale of it, the lack of control. Lenin defended it as necessary. In February 1919, the party tried to limit the Cheka's judicial powers slightly in areas not under martial law, but its authority remained huge. By 1920, the Cheka was this incredibly powerful, feared institution.
And concentration camps were established then, too.
A decree in April 1919 formalized concentration camps under Cheka, controlled a precursor to the Gulag system. Initially for counter-revolutionaries, but they soon held all sorts of perceived enemies.
Deporting intellectuals. Attacking the church.
Yes. In July 1922, on Lenin's orders, a wave of intellectuals considered hostile were arrested and deported or kicked out. And in May 1922, he issued orders calling for the execution of anti-Bolshevik priests, part of a wider crackdown on religious institutions, especially the Orthodox Church, but other faiths too.
On top of all this internal repression, the Bolsheviks were fighting a massive civil war and also got into a war with Poland. Did Lenin expect such fierce resistance?
He definitely expected resistance from the old ruling classes, the aristocracy, bourgeoisie, but he seems to have underestimated just how widespread and intense it would be.
Who were the main players in the Civil War?
Primarily, it was the Bolshevik Red Army versus the anti-Bolshevik White Army. But it was more complex than that. You had independence movements in places like Ukraine and the Baltics, peasant armies, the Green Armies fighting everyone, and foreign powers intervening.
Who made up the White Army?
Mostly former Tsarist officers and soldiers. Key leaders were Denikin in the south, Kolchak in Siberia, Yudich in the northwest. They got some support weapons, supplies, some troops from Western powers like Britain, France, the U.S., Japan.
Why did the West intervene?
Various reasons. Anger over Russia pulling out of WWI, fear of communism spreading, protecting their own interests. But their direct military impact was often limited.
And Trotsky's role in building the Red Army was crucial.
Absolutely critical. Lenin put Trotsky in charge of creating the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. Trotsky made the controversial but necessary decision, supported by Lenin against some opposition, to recruit thousands of former Tsarist officers for their military expertise.
Under supervision.
Oh yes, under the watchful eye of political commissars to ensure loyalty.
What advantages did the Red Army have?
They controlled the industrial heartland, including Moscow and Petrograd, and the main railway network. The Whites were geographically scattered, poorly coordinated. Plus, the Whites' strong Russian nationalism often pushed ethnic minorities towards the Bolsheviks, who at least promised autonomy.
It was a brutal war on both sides. Terror was widespread.
Extremely brutal. Both sides committed atrocities. The White armies also carried out their own white terror against suspected Bolsheviks and were often responsible for horrific anti-Jewish pogroms, even though Lenin himself repeatedly condemned anti-Semitism.
And the Tsar and his family were killed during this time.
July 1918, in Yekaterinburg. The local Soviet authorities executed Nicholas II and his family as white forces were closing in. There's no smoking gun proving Lenin ordered it directly, but many historians think he almost certainly sanctioned it or approved it after the fact.
How did Lenin justify it?
Publicly, he drew parallels with the French Revolution, executing King Louis XVI, saw it as a necessary step against a tyrant.
There was internal opposition, too, even from fellow revolutionaries, the left SRs.
Yes, after they opposed the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, the left SRs became openly hostile. In July 1918, a left SR assassinated the German ambassador in Moscow, trying to restart the war.
And they staged an uprising.
A brief, doomed uprising in Moscow. Shelled the Kremlin, seized the post office, but Trotsky's forces crushed it quickly. The left SR leaders were arrested, though generally treated less harshly than other opponents.
The end of WWI also created chaos in Eastern Europe, leading to war with Poland.
Exactly. As German troops withdrew, both Soviet Russia and the newly independent Poland tried to grab territory in between. Both had expansionist ambitions. Clashes started in February 1919, quickly escalating into the Polish-Soviet War.
And Lenin saw this as a chance to spread the revolution.
He did. He thought the Polish working class would rise up and welcome the Red Army. Polish forces initially pushed into Ukraine, took Kiev in May 1920. The Red Army counterattacked, drove them back towards Warsaw.
Lenin ordered an invasion of Poland.
Against some warnings, yes. He was convinced revolution was imminent there. It was a disastrous miscalculation. The Polish workers didn't rise up, and the Red Army was decisively defeated at the Battle of Warsaw in August 1920.
A major setback.
Huge setback. The Poles pushed the Red Army back. The Sovnarkom had to sue for peace. The Treaty of Riga in March 1921 ceded large parts of modern Ukraine and Belarus to Poland, a blow to Lenin's hopes for immediate European revolution.
But Lenin remained committed to global revolution. He established the Comintern for this purpose.
Deeply committed. After the WWI armistice, he really believed European revolution was just around the corner. The Sovnarkom actively backed communist regimes that popped up briefly, like Belakun's in Hungary, the Bavarian Soviet Republic, socialist uprisings in Germany, like the Spartacists.
And used the Red Army in neighboring states.
During the Civil War, yes. Sent troops into newly independent states like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine to help local Marxists set up Soviet-style governments. Often led to more fighting, but ultimately communist regimes, heavily influenced by Moscow, were established. Same happened in Outer Mongolia.
Did Lenin want to just annex these places?
Some Bolsheviks did, but Lenin insisted on formally respecting national sovereignty, at least on paper. But he made sure these governments were effectively under Moscow's control.
And it says in here.
The Communist International, formally founded in Moscow, March 1919. Brought together communist parties from all over the world under Bolshevik leadership explicitly to promote and coordinate world revolution.
The early 1920s brought yet more crises, notably a terrible famine. This led to a major policy shift. The new economic policy, the NEP, that seems like a big U-turn.
It was a significant shift born out of desperation, really. Russia was hit by a devastating famine in the early 20s, a result of years of war, civil war, and especially those harsh grain requisitioning policies of war communism.
This led to peasant revolt.
Widespread revolts. Peasants fighting back against grain seizures. The biggest was the Tambov Rebellion, which the Red Army crushed brutally. Then in February 1921, massive strikes broke out among workers in Petrograd, protesting food shortages, government policies.
How did the government respond?
Martial law in Petrograd, sent in the army. And then the Kronstadt Rebellion in March 1921.
The sailors, weren't they early Bolshevik supporters?
They had been. That's what made it so shocking. The sailors at the Kronstadt naval base revolted against the government, demanded more political freedom for socialist groups, free trade for peasants, an end to grain requisitioning.
How did Lenin see this?
As an extremely dangerous threat. Claimed the sailors were manipulated by SRs and foreign powers. He ordered it suppressed immediately and ruthlessly. Trotsky commanded the assault. The Red Army stormed Kronstadt, crushed the rebellion by March 17th. Captured rebels faced severe reprisals.
So realizing the depth of the crisis, the NEP.
Exactly. Recognizing things were dire, Lenin introduced the new economic policy in February 1921. Formally adopted in April. He explained it in his essay on the tax in kind. He called war communism a temporary necessity of the Civil War, and NEP a necessary temporary retreat.
What did the NEP actually do?
It allowed small-scale private businesses to reopen, brought back wages, allowed peasants to sell surplus produce on the open market after paying a fixed tax in kind, not just having it seized.
But the state kept control of the big stuff.
Oh yes, heavy industry, transport, foreign trade. The commanding heights of the economy remained state-controlled, but it was a definite step back towards market mechanisms. Lenin himself called it state capitalism.
How was it received within the party?
Caused a lot of debate, unease. Some hardliners saw it as a betrayal of socialism, but many historians think the NEP was crucial. It stabilized the economy, calmed social unrest, arguably saved the Bolshevik regime from collapse.
Were there also efforts to rebuild and modernize during this period?
Yes, amidst the crises. January 1920, they introduced compulsory labor law for everyone aged 1650, and Lenin became a huge champion of the Gyoro plan. This is an ambitious project to electrify the entire country, started February 1920.
That's where his famous quote comes from.
Communism is Soviet power, plus the electrification of the whole country. Showed his belief that technology was key to building socialism.
And foreign trade, trying to break Russia's isolation.
Definitely. They sent a delegation to the Genoa Conference in 1922. Lenin hoped to go, but was too ill. They signed a key treaty with Germany there, the Treaty of Rapallo, and later a trade deal with the UK.
What was Lenin's strategy with these deals?
He hoped they'd not only boost the Russian economy, but also deepen rivalries between capitalist countries, maybe hasten their downfall. He even considered leasing Siberian oil field to an American company to stir up trouble between the US and Japan, always thinking strategically on a global scale.
Around this time, the early 1920s, Lenin's health really starts to fail, and simultaneously, tensions with Stalin begin to surface, setting the stage for the later power struggle.
Yeah, his health took a sharp downturn. Apparently, he was uncomfortable with the huge 50th birthday celebrations the party threw for him in April. 1920 poems, biographies, big public events all over Russia.
His collected works were published then, too.
Yes, between 1920 and 1926, though some sensitive stuff was left out. And several prominent Westerners visited him around 1920. H.G. Wells, Bertrand Russell, anarchists Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman left interesting accounts.
And Inessa Armand visited.
She paid a final visit. She was unwell herself. Lenin urged her to go south to rest, but tragically, she caught cholera there and died in September 1920. Her body was brought back, buried at the Kremlin wall. Lenin was reportedly devastated at the funeral.
When did Lenin's own health really decline?
From late 1921 onwards. Increased sensitivity to noise, insomnia, severe headaches. The Politburo made him leave Moscow for the Gorky estate in July to rest. Nadia and his sister Maria cared for him.
He suffered from depression.
Reportedly periods of deep depression. Even talked about suicide to Krupskaya, and Stalin asked them for poison.
Doctors were brought in?
A whole team, including foreign specialists. They debated the cause complications from the 1918 bullets. They tried surgery to remove them in April 22. Didn't help. Neurasthenia, cerebral arteriosclerosis. There were even rumors of syphilis, though unsubstantiated.
Then the strokes began.
May 1922, the first major stroke. Temporary loss of speech, right side paralysis. He recovered somewhat by July, even returned briefly to Moscow in October. But then a second, much worse stroke in December sent him back to Gorky for good.
But even physically weakened, his mind was still engaged in politics. He was worried about the party's direction.
Oh, absolutely. Still keenly interested, tried to exert influence when he could. For instance, during the trial of SR leaders in mid-1922 on trumped-up charges, Lenin, though ill, pushed hard for harsh sentences, shows his continued intolerance for opposition.
They weren't executed then.
Got long prison terms initially, though many were killed later under Stalin. And with Lenin's okay, the government basically crushed the Mensheviks as a political force. By March 1923, expelled from state jobs, members arrested, sent to camps.
What were his main concerns about the state itself?
In his final months of activity, he got really worried about bureaucracy creeping back in. Corruption, inefficiency looked worryingly like the old czarist system sometimes. He wrote sharply criticizing this filthy bureaucratic swamp, proposed radical reforms.
And this leads to his famous testament, dictated when he was very ill.
Yes, December 1922, January 1923. He dictates these notes, letters, gives incredibly frank assessments of his comrades, especially Trotsky and Stalin.
What did he say about them?
Expressed serious concerns about Stalin. His growing power, his personality recommended Stalin be removed as general secretary, said he was too rude, likely to abuse power.
And Trotsky
praised Trotsky's abilities, most capable man in the present Central Committee, but also noted his excessive self-confidence, a tendency towards bossiness, administration.
He wrote other things then, too.
Dictated an essay slamming the workers' and peasants' inspectorate for inefficiency, calling for more working-class people in government. Wrote about needing more literacy, discipline, encouraging peasant cooperatives as a path to socialism. You can feel his anxiety about the future in these last writings.
While Lenin was ill, Stalin was consolidating power.
Very much so. As general secretary, Stalin started promoting his allies, building his network, carefully crafting this image as Lenin's loyal follower and heir apparent. In December 1922, Stalin was put in charge of Lenin's medical care, controlling access to him.
And their personal relationships soured. Major disagreements.
Yes, big time. Lenin strongly defended the state monopoly on foreign trade. Stalin, surprisingly, led a faction opposing it. But the biggest blow-up was the Georgian affair.
What was that?
Stalin wanted to basically force Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan directly into the Russian SFSR, ignoring local communist leaders' objections. Lenin saw this as great Russian chauvinism, a betrayal of self-determination. He wanted a federation of equal republics, the Union of Soviet Republics of Europe and Asia.
And Stalin was rude to Kripskaya.
Reportedly very rude, swore at her over the phone when she passed some of Lenin's notes to Trotsky. Lenin found out, was absolutely furious, dictated an angry letter demanding an apology, threatening to break off relations with Stalin.
Did Stalin back down on the federation issue?
Eventually, yes. He accepted a modified plan, leading to the formation of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, in December 1922. Lenin was elected as chairman, but it was largely symbolic by then due to his health. But the Georgian affair, Stalin's behavior, it cemented Lenin's deep concerns about him, reflected clearly in the testament.
And Lenin's health just continued to worsen into 1923. His death in January 1924 was obviously a huge moment.
A devastating final decline. March 1923, a third massive stroke. Left him unable to speak, paralyzed further. Some sensory aphasia too, trouble processing language.
Any recovery?
Very slight, brief improvements in May. Some movement, a few words. He made one last, very poignant visit to the Kremlin in October 1923. In his final week at Gorky, Zinoviev, Kamev, Bukharin visited him. Bukharin was the last comrade to see him alive. And then the end came. January 21st, 1924. His condition worsened suddenly, fell into a coma, died shortly after. He was 53, the official cause. Incurable disease of the blood vessels, sclerosis.
The reaction was immediate and massive, the beginning of the Lenin cult.
Absolutely. The government announced it the next day. Huge orchestrated outpouring of grief. Delegations went to Gorky on January 23rd to view the body. Then the coffin was carried by Stalin, Zinoviev, Bukharin, other leaders, taken to Moscow by train.
Lying in state.
In the House of Trade Unions. Hundreds of thousands filed past over 3 days, queuing for hours in the bitter cold. On January 26, a big memorial meeting at the Congress of Soviets eulogies from Kalinin, Zinoviev, Stalin. Stalin really used his speech to position himself as Lenin's true successor.
Where is Trotsky?
Conspicuously absent. He was recovering from illness down in the Caucasus. Later claims Stalin deliberately sent him a telegram with the wrong funeral date to keep him away.
And the funeral itself.
The next day, January 27th, in Red Square. Military music, more eulogies. Then his body was placed in a temporary wooden mausoleum.
But Kripskaya didn't want him preserved.
She strongly objected, wanted him buried simply next to his mother. But the government overruled her, decided to embalm the body, put it on permanent display in Red Square.
They even studied his brain.
In 1925, set up an institute just to study his brain, found severe sclerosis. Then in 1929, the Politburo approved building the permanent granite mausoleum we see today, finished in 1933.
And the body's still there.
Still there. It was moved to Siberia for safety during WWII, but returned. Remains on display in the mausoleum, a potent symbol, still debated in Russia today.
Let's dig into his political ideology a bit more. Obviously rooted in Marxism, but Leninism became its own distinct, powerful force.
He was absolutely a devoted Marxist, and he genuinely believes his interpretation, which Martov actually labeled Leninism back in 1904, initially as criticism was the correct, orthodox understanding of Marx for the early 20th century, especially for Russia.
The ultimate goal was communism.
Always. That stateless, classless, egalitarian society. Collective ownership, no exploitation, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Volkogonov, his biographer, said Lenin had this deep, sincere faith in communism's inevitability and the path he'd set for Russia.
But there was a necessary step before that, socialism.
Yes. Following Marx, societies couldn't just jump to communism. You needed a transitional socialist phase. Social ownership of production, yes, but also the dictatorship of the proletariat necessary, he argued, to suppress the old bourgeoisie and build the socialist economy. He later described socialism in On Cooperation as a system of civilized cooperators, where production belongs to society and the workers hold power.
Was his thinking aligned with Western Marxists before WWI?
Largely, yes, before 1914. But he was also deeply influenced by Russian revolutionary traditions, including the Narodniks, especially their focus on the peasantry's potential, though he fit that into his proletarian-led framework. He constantly adapted theory to circumstances.
So Leninism is really Marxism adapted.
You could say Marxism developed through Lenin, becoming Leninism. His adaptations were so significant, they created this distinct ideology with massive global impact.
A key difference was his view on democracy and the state, wasn't it? Compared to Western European Marxists looking towards parliaments.
Big difference. Lenin famously claimed, Soviet government is 1,000,000 times more democratic than the most democratic bourgeois republic. He basically dismissed Western parliamentary democracy as a sham, just democracy for the rich.
His vision of the proletarian state.
While aiming for the state to eventually wither away under communism, initially he stressed the need for a strong, centralized state controlled by the proletariat via the party and Soviets. This was needed to crush counter-revolutionaries.
Unlike Kautsky and others.
Right. Many Western Marxists, like Karl Kautsky, envisioned a more gradual path through existing democratic parliaments, win elections, implement socialism. Lenin thought the bourgeois state itself was rigged, had to be overthrown violently and replaced by this new type of state, the dictatorship of the proletariat. He argued that was true democracy, direct worker participation via Soviets, recalling elected officials.
What about his views on nationalism and ethnic minorities? It seems complex, balancing self-determination with unity.
It was complex and evolved. Before 1917, he supported the right of nations to self-determination. Even secession from the Russian Empire saw it as undermining Tsarism, building solidarity.
But after the revolution,
The priority shifted. Maintaining a unified Soviet state became paramount for survival against internal and external enemies. So, while formally recognizing the right to secede, the Bolshevik government often used political pressure, even military force, to prevent or reverse secessions.
aiming for voluntary reunion.
That was the idea, a voluntary union based on proletarian internationalism led by the Bolsheviks. But it led to conflicts in Ukraine, Georgia, Poland, Finland, the Baltics, where independence movements were strong. Ultimately, they only fully recognized independence where they couldn't militarily prevent it. A pragmatic approach, balancing ideology and strategy.
What about Lenin, the man? His personality, appearance, character. What do contemporaries and historians say?
Well, he clearly saw himself as a man of destiny, making history. Absolutely convinced of the revolution's righteousness and his own crucial role. Louis Fisher described him as favoring radical change, extremes, seeing things in black and white.
Pipes acknowledged his discipline.
Richard Pipes, though critical, noted his extraordinary capacity for disciplined work and total dedication. Also mentioned his charisma, his ability to inspire. Volkogonov said he influenced people by his very nature.
But Gorky described his appearance as ordinary.
Yes, Maxim Gorky said he looked surprisingly ordinary, not much like a leader, stocky, balding. Contrast with the image of immense power.
But certain traits come through consistently. Iron will, discipline, ruthlessness.
Definitely. His writings, accounts from others, they paint a picture of incredible inner strength, almost fanatical devotion. Exceptional self-discipline, unwavering resolve, deep contempt for enemies.
Yeah.
Cold, calculating determination.
His belief in Marxism was absolute.
Seems so. Robert Service noted his intense emotions, deep hatred of Tsarism, and almost religious emotional attachments to Marxist heroes and their writings. James White called their teachings scripture, or dogma for Lenin. Volkogonov said Marxism was absolute truth to him, called him fanatical. Bertrand Russell sensed a religious faith in the dogma. Christopher Reed compared him to a secular prophet, and he was a staunch atheist, saw socialism as inherently anti-religious.
But was there another side? Volkogonov suggested a contrast.
Yeah, Volkogonov noted he could seem gentle, even kind in private, enjoyed laughter, pets, showed sensitivity, but snap, discussed class or politics, and he became sharp, uncompromising, hateful even, sometimes with grim humor.
How did he identify ethnically and view Russia?
Identified as Russian. But Service called him quite arrogant on national and cultural matters, believed other European nations, especially Germany, were culturally superior to backward Russia. Frustrated by perceived Russian dishonesty, lack of discipline, wanted Russia to be more European.
And his personal tastes. Art, literature. Surprisingly conservative.
Reportedly, yes. Didn't like modernist art or literature expressionism, futurism. Preferred realism, Russian classics. Held fairly traditional views on gender, marriage.
His relationship with Kripskaya was enduring.
Lifelong partnership. They married in exile, stayed together. Both apparently regretted not having children. He maintained close ties with his family members too. Outside family, Inessa Armand is often seen as perhaps his only truly intimate friend.
Practical skills, lifestyle.
Fluent in French, German, English, attentive to health, exercise regularly, cycling, swimming, hunting, loved hiking in Switzerland, fond of pets, especially cats. Rejected extravagance, lived simply. Pipes called his existence Spartan, almost ascetic, meticulous worker, needed quiet. Fisher noted his lack of vanity.
What about the personality cult that grew around him?
He reportedly felt uncomfortable with it, but also recognized it could be useful for unifying the communist movement. A pragmatic view again.
Finally, let's talk about his legacy. It's huge, complex, still fiercely debated. How is he viewed overall?
Undeniably massive. Albert Rees has argued if the October Revolution was the 20th century's biggest event, Lenin must be its most important leader, for good or ill. James White called him an undisputed giant. Robert Service, a prime mover. Christopher Reed, a universally known symbol. James Ryan, one of the most significant and influential individuals. Time magazine put him in their top 100 people of the 20th century, top 25 politicians ever.
Western views vary widely.
Hugely, from sympathetic like Christopher Hill to very critical like Pipes or Gelately. Others like Reed or Lars Lee try for more nuance. Revisionism. Pro-Lenin takes often focus on his adaptation of Marxism to Russia.
How did Soviet views differ from Western ones?
Soviet portrayals depicted him as this genius, recognizing historical inevitability, guiding Russia towards it. Much Western historiography traditionally saw him as a power-hungry manipulator using ideology. Revisionists now put more emphasis on existing conditions, popular pressures influencing him. Even Einstein weighed in, honored Lenin's self-sacrifice for social justice, but found his methods impractical, yet saw him renewing humanity's conscience.
And the nature of his rule? Totalitarian, dictator, still debated.
Highly debated.
Yes.
Many historians use terms like totalitarian, police state, one-party dictatorship. Many call Lenin himself a dictator. But others, like James Ryan, argue he wasn't an absolute dictator whose every word was law, pointing to times he was overruled. Fisher saw him as authoritarian, but not a Stalin-type dictator.
Volkogonov's view
Argued Lenin built the foundation for party dictatorship, which Stalin then turned into one-man dictatorship.
Marxist scholars disagree.
Many argue it wasn't a simple dictatorship, but a form of proletarian democracy, just different from Western models. Ryan also brings up Paul LeBlanc's point that Western leaders could be just as ruthless. And Ryan argues Lenin saw revolutionary violence as a necessary means to an ultimately violence-free communist end.
Any more positive takes?
J. Arch Getty suggested Lenin deserves credit for the idea that the meek shall inherit the earth, that a political movement based on equality and social justice was possible. And some modern left intellectuals, like Tuzak, call for reviving Lenin's revolutionary spirit today.
How has his legacy been treated in the Soviet Union and since its collapse?
In the USSR, there was that massive, elaborate personality cult. Nina Tumarkin called it quasi-religious. Statues, portraits everywhere, cities, streets named after him, Leningrad being the most famous. The Order of Lenin was the top award.
Krupskaya disapproved.
She did, publicly criticize the extremes. Interestingly, after Stalin, Khrushchev used Lenin's writings, especially the Testament criticizing Stalin, to legitimize de-Stalinization. Gorbachev also invoked Lenin for glasnost and perestroika.
What happened after 1991?
Lenin's archives were opened up, thousands of documents released. Since then, there's been this constant debate in Russia. Should his body be removed from the mausoleum and buried? Yeltsin supported it, citing the Orthodox Church's wishes. Putin has opposed it, arguing it disrespects older generations.
Statues came down.
Some did, controversially. The Russian Communist Party fiercely defends his legacy. Thousands of Lenin statues still stand in Russia. But in Ukraine, after Euromaidan and decommunization laws in 2015, many were dismantled. Ironically, Russian forces put some back up in occupied areas in 2022, though more as a symbol of Russian power than communist revival.
And its influence internationally on the communist movement.
Immense. After his death, Stalin formalized Marxism-Leninism as the official ideology of the USSR and communist parties worldwide, though interpreted differently everywhere. Trotsky, in exile, slammed Stalinism as a betrayal of true Leninism.
It became foundational for other revolutions.
Yes. Marxism-Leninism influenced or fused with Stalinism, Juche in North Korea, Mao Zedong thought in China, Ho Chi Minh thought in Vietnam, Castroism in Cuba. Though post-war, many Western European communist parties moved away from strict Leninism, calling themselves Marxist or democratic socialist instead.
So wrapping up our deep dive, we've journeyed through Lenin's extraordinary life, his radicalization, leading the revolution, building the Soviet state. His ideology, Leninism, was this potent adaptation of Marxism, and his impact on the 20th century is just undeniable and still incredibly controversial.
He absolutely remains a figure of enormous historical weight. His ideas, his actions, they still provoke intense reactions, still shape political debates today. You really can't understand the 20th century without understanding Lenin.
Which brings us to a final thought for you, the listener. Think about this. How can studying someone as complex, as controversial, as world-altering as Lenin sharpen our own understanding? Our understanding of power, of ideology's potent force, of the dynamics that drive huge historical changes both then and perhaps even now?
It's definitely worth exploring further. There are so many sources, so many different perspectives on his life and his legacy.